3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of false flag operations. So when it comes to territorial expansion, historically many conquerors have used a tactic known as false flag operations, where you essentially pretend that the nation you are targeting to conquer started a war with you first, and thus you must retaliate to protect your people. In reality, though, this is all a lie and just a clever way of justifying your invasion of another country. So, one of the first historic examples of a false flag operation came from Sweden in 1788, where Swedish soldiers dressed up in fake Russian uniforms attacked a Swedish base on the Russian and Swedish border at the time, and this would then give the King of Sweden, Gustav III, the public support he needed to go to war with Russia, in what would be called the Russo-Swedish War. Now moving on to the era of World War II, there were several different false flag operations that had occurred in this time period. The first one I'm going to talk about is Nazi Germany, who engaged in a similar false flag operation to justify its invasion of Poland. And next, there is also the Soviet Union, who also did a false flag operation in World War II to justify its invasion of Finland. And in this case, the Soviet troops purposefully bombed a Soviet village, only to blame it on Finland and then justify their war against Finland and invasion of Finland. And finally, moving towards the modern era, today we have Russia, who for the last several years has been utilizing false flags in order to drum up support for its desire to conquer Ukraine and take over part of Georgia. For example, in 2008, Russia sent soldiers into Georgia pretending to be rebels and then sent in the Russian army to protect those so-called rebels, who of course just so happened wanted to join Russia and wanted Russia's support. And then in 2014, Russia of course famously invaded and took over the part of Ukraine known as Crimea by having Russian soldiers pretend to be Ukrainian rebels wanting to join Russia, just like what had happened in Georgia in 2008. And Russia would then later in 2014 also do the same tactic in the Ukrainian region of Donbass. And then finally, of course, the infamous war going on today. In 2022, Russia would launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine after manufacturing fake videos of supposed attacks on Russian speakers in Ukraine. And in turn, Russia would use this to generate support for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in order to protect Russian speakers, despite the fact that Russia's been orchestrating all of this themselves, and that this is just all military strategy in pursuit of territorial expansion. And so what do we make of this? We're living in a world right now where essentially this military tactic going back at least to 1788 is constantly being used by Russia in the 21st century to attack other nations. And it could potentially be, especially if Ukraine is eventually conquered, could be used against other countries. And of course, nations like China perhaps may look at this and take notes in pursuing perhaps the invasion of Taiwan, and other countries around the world may also be doing this to pursue their own territorial expansion. So this is why when it comes to geopolitics, this is something that everyone needs to learn about in school, because it's incredibly important to prevent future conflicts that ordinary people around the world are familiar with military strategies and the tricks that governments play on their own citizens to justify wars. Because far too often around the world, especially in authoritarian regimes, people are often very much in the dark and not very educated about these things, and thus they're incredibly susceptible to being tricked and convinced by their government that everything their government does is just perfect and there's no reason to be concerned. And the reality is you have to be more skeptical of governments in general, especially governments that seem to be in power for long periods of time and tend to censor criticism. Obviously, if you look at Vladimir Putin, he's been ruling Russia for over 2 decades and is about to get reelected again in a so-called democratic election, which obviously is not real. But for the Russian people, it very much seems real for many of them who just assume that they are the victims and that their great government is not lying to them about these false flag operations, that these are things really happening and that Russia is this protector of people. So whether you live in a democratic nation that actually has real elections or you live in a dictatorship, you cannot trust governments too much because far too often, even in democratic countries, a person will come to power that will look to kind of bend and break the rules to support their personal ambitions at the expense of their own people. And so with that, always be skeptical and be careful about believing what your government has to say, especially when it comes to launching wars against other countries. So with that, as always, billions of years led to you, so make the most of it.